Thank you. I am going to speak about some issues related to policy and how they hurt or harm the settlement of refugees in Canada, and secondly about community support. So in terms of policy issues, I'm going to just look at 4 of them. One is long processing times, secondly family reunification, thirdly the importance of security of status, and then financial security. So let's look at the question of long processing times. So in terms of, these are some processing times from 2015. For government-assisted refugees, the total how long people waited overseas, these are refugees waiting to be resettled, 15 months in the process for government-assisted refugees overall. Privately sponsored refugees, it comes up at 51 months. And it varies a lot, as you can see, by the visa office. So these are just a few of the visa offices that I've selected to fit it onto one slide. Amman at the lower level of 3 or 11 months for privately sponsored. But we're going also to much longer times. Nairobi, infamously very slow, 35 months for government-assisted refugees, privately sponsored refugees, 69 months. So I think that when we're talking about refugees settling in Canada, it's important to bear in mind what is the process that they have been going through and what is the situation that they have been in before they come to Canada. And of course, it's the nature of being a refugee without a durable solution that you're probably in a bad situation. You're probably not having access to all of the education and healthcare and so on that you need. So these long processing times have an important impact. Secondly, family reunification. Tom has already spoken very eloquently about the importance of family reunification. This is an issue that always comes up within the CCR, the Canadian Council for Refugees, with among our members as one of the key priorities. So Canada, in its policy, divides families into the immediate families, so spouses, partners, and children, which is about to go back up under 22 years, thankfully. Immediate family, you have a certain right to be reunited with them. Now, for resettled refugees, hopefully they arrive with the whole family intact, but the reality is that they often don't. Sometimes it's because the one family member was in a different location and the processing doesn't start at the same time. Sometimes the family member location was unknown or couldn't be contacted at the time. So the government has foreseen this process of a 1-year window where the family member can be resettled. However, the processing is extremely slow, and we've been hearing increasing numbers of cases of this immediate family members in this 1-year window situation, which is causing a lot of concern. We have just sent in a submission to the Immigration Department asking them to address this issue and to set some reasonable standards for processing. It should not take 3-4 years for a child or a spouse to be reunited in Canada with a resettled refugee. Secondly, let us take a look at the other family members, and these are the people that Tom is talking about. Well, our immigration program does not give a provision for you to be reunited. Realistically, if you're a resettled refugee, the other family class sponsorships, you have to have levels of income that are out of question for most resettled refugees. So what do? They go to Tom or to other people and say, could you sponsor my sister and her family, or what many other family members that you're looking at. And then you find yourself stuck with the caps and the levels that Tom was also speaking about. So we talk about the echo effect, which is whenever you have a group of refugees resettled, most of them will have somebody that they're concerned about, that they want to find a solution to for. And so private sponsors then receive, knocking at their doors, requests, could you sponsor this individual or family? The numbers that we have here The target for 2017, which has just been announced for privately sponsored refugees, is 16,000. Now this year the target was 17,800. But the numbers of cases that were waiting to be processed in June of 2016, which is the most recent number that I have, is nearly 34,000. So you can quickly see that based on that, if you were putting in an application now, that person is not going to arrive until 2018 if you're able to put in an application because of the cap system. So this is what we're up against, and we don't yet know or see what is going to happen to all of the pressures of the echo effect, all of the people who want desperately and can't really settle here while they're worried about family members that are in a precarious situation. So on a more upbeat note, the issue of secure status. So I think that we in Canada are very lucky that the refugees that are resettled here have permanent residence. It's something that we see when we compare with other countries, for example, Germany, who resettle a lot of Syrian refugees much more quickly than Canada, but they were on temporary visas, and it's something that we heard, you know, it's very difficult for people to feel secure if they don't have a permanent residence. So it's a very helpful policy provision that we have. On the other hand, we have been struggling with the issue of cessation. So the law was changed in 2012, which made it possible for refugees, whether resettled or refugees who made a claim in Canada, to lose their permanent residence if the situation in the country of origin changed and they returned to that country. The government could argue that you no longer need refugee protection, and therefore you can lose your permanent residence. So this is, we've seen, has created a lot of a sense of insecurity for refugees, even though they have permanent residence. Now, obviously the real security comes when you have access to citizenship. So that is something that we find is really important for refugees. Of course, also just in terms of practically traveling, until you have your citizenship, you can't travel except on a refugee travel document, which is often very difficult. But unfortunately, access to citizenship has become much more difficult. The waiting time is longer, although there's a bill before the Parliament which would bring it back a little bit again. But also there are increased barriers in terms of far higher fees to pay, which if you're dealing with a family that is struggling financially, makes it inaccessible. And then there's been the change in terms of how you do the assessment of language, which also particularly affects refugees. So I think we need to be thinking critically about the impact of large numbers of refugees potentially who will have the permanent residence but really struggle to get to citizenship. Financial security. Obviously, it's important for refugees to have that financial security, which is provided in the case of government-assisted refugees through the government, privately sponsored refugees through the private sponsors. I think pretty much everybody in this room is probably aware that social assistance rates are not sufficient to live comfortably on, and the amount that refugees receive, newly arrived refugees, is tied to social assistance rates. So that means that there is a real struggle for people to survive, and I think that all of us who have had to see close up what is it going to be looking like for somebody to try to survive on social assistance rates, the amount of money that they're giving, we're making things very difficult for newly arrived refugees. And then on top of that, you have the transportation loans. So some of the Syrians have been exempted from having to pay back for their transportation to Canada, but many other refugees continue to have to pay that. And that, again, is something that undermines financial security and also undermines their psychological security. So finally, in my just concluding remarks, I just to say something quickly about the importance of community organizations, both those who are funded directly by government to provide immediate services to refugees, and more generally the many different community organizations that support newcomers and especially refugees. So we have a very vibrant network of refugee supporting organizations right across Canada. I would say, though, that probably Canada could do more to exploit the skill and expertise of those organizations. And for looking back, for example, in terms of the Syrian movement, although, of course, it's the NGOs that do the delivery of the services on the ground, they were not brought into the initial planning phase for the Syrian movement, which compromised their ability to plan adequately and to provide the services for immediate arrival. Obviously, private sponsors as well. And in terms of broader community involvement, I think we've had a lot of, I've just been here today, but I think we've talked a lot about the importance of all the different levels of society working together to provide support. I would go into it longer, but I'm out of time, so I will stop there.